and ancient ports, on view through May 14th. Tonight's event is the second in a series of lectures presented in connection with the Turner Show, and we are privileged to have as this evening's speaker, Itay Sapir. A specialist in early modern art and aesthetics, Dr. Sapir is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Art History at the University of Quebec at Montreal. He received his master's degree from Tel Aviv University in 2000, and in 2008, he completed his PhD, awarded jointly by the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis of the University of Amsterdam and the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Since that time, he has held prestigious fellowships at the Kunsthistorisches Institute in Florence, at Tel Aviv University, and at the Italian Academy at Columbia University. These were followed by his appointment in 2012 at the University of Quebec. Dr. Sapir is the author of the book Ténèbres sans leçon, Aesthetics and Epistemology of Roman Tenebrist Painting, 1595 to 1610. Published in 2012, this thought-provoking study of the work of Caravaggio, Adam Alzheimer, and their followers connects the predominance of shadows and darkness in their paintings to broader cultural trends and scientific knowledge at the turn of the 17th century. Dr. Sapir is also co-editor of the volume Inside Knowledge, Undoing Ways of Knowing in the Humanities, published in 2009, and of The Nature of Naturalism, a special issue of the Canadian Art Review, published in 2016. His latest book, co-edited with Alessandro Nova and Hannah Grundler, and entitled The Announcement, Annunciations and Beyond, will be published next year. Among his numerous other writings, his article on the port scenes of the 17th century painter Claude Lorrain was of fundamental importance and an inspiration to my colleagues and me as we carried out our work on Turner, whose own port scenes were created in emulation of and in dialogue with Claude's. Dr. Sapir's elegant and illuminating text explores the port as an intrinsically binary space, evocative of a wealth of complex associations. These deeper resonances underlying the motif of the port are the subject of his lecture tonight. Following the lecture, we welcome you to join us in the Turner exhibition, which will remain open for half an hour until 7:30. At this moment, I would like to remind you to please turn off and silence your cell phones and other devices. Thank you. And now, please join me in welcoming Itay Sapir.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for this very generous introduction. And thanks, of course, to Susan Galassi, who invited me, and who is here. I don't see her, but she's here, I'm sure. And Xavier Salmon, who also sent me the more official invitation. I have to say I'm very, very happy to be here in this museum because this has always been one of my favorite museums in the world. And I didn't think I would one day speak here and give a lecture here, so I'm particularly moved about that. And I was also obviously very, very happy to see the fabulous exhibition of Turner that if you haven't seen yet, you'll see with me after my lecture. One of my dreams actually has always been organizing an exhibition of the Claude port scenes, the port scenes of Claude Lorrain. So it will become clear why, I think, during my lecture. And so in a way, this is an almost realization of a dream. It's a second best solution, I think, to have here the port scenes of Turner, who are definitely as beautiful. It is surely one of the strongest and most moving acts of homage in the history of art. Joseph Mallord William Turner's demand in 1829 that his two depictions of the port of Carthage, bequeathed to the National Gallery in London, be hung in perpetuity next to two comparable compositions by the 17th century French painter, active mostly in Rome, Claude Gelée, known as Le Lorrain, or more often, Claude Lorrain. Turner's admiration for Claude and the inspiration he found in his predecessor's works are so well known today that we do not realize anymore how odd they actually are. For in many ways, the two artists are in fact as opposed to one another as can be, and at least their popular images are so incongruous with each other that one would expect the later artist to find little interest in the French landscape painter of 2 centuries before him. To be sure, both Claude and Turner are recognized as masters of light and color, painters whose nuances of brightness and shades had no rivals in their respective time periods. And yet, Claude's image as a calm artist is diametrically opposed to Turner's explosions of sound and fury. Indeed, Joanna Shears-Seidenstein, whom you just heard, in her article for the Free Catalogue, describes this opposition in the context of Turner's Regulus, loosely based, here it is, on Claude's Seaport with the Villa Medici. The article quotes a critic commenting in 1837 that Turner was just the converse of Claude. Instead of the repose of beauty, the soft serenity and mellow light of an Italian scene, here, in Turner's painting, all is glare, turbulence, and uneasiness. From a more technical point of view, Turner responded to Claude's perfectly smooth textures with an unprecedented amount of impasto. Then, the painter's public personae could hardly have been more different, with Claude the epitome of the discreet artist, about whose life almost nothing is known, and who was surely calm in that respect too, and Turner a temperamental, controversial celebrity. And above all, perhaps, one is struck by the difference in their position in the history of art more generally. The earlier painter is perceived as an immensely talented but ultimately rather conventional artist, catering to the taste of relatively conservative patrons. Indeed, Claude has been the darling of the British high classes in particular in the centuries passing since his own lifetime. And it is not for theoretical depth or subversive politics that he was revered by rich collectors in his contemporary Rome and later in English aristocratic circles. It is rather as the magician of ideal landscapes, of ethereal light, and of facile nostalgia that Claude has entered the canon of art history. The story of the cataclysm that around 1600 bluntly contested the representational system of the Renaissance and created the basis for a brave new world that we would later call Baroque, this story is well known, and I narrated my own account, as was mentioned, and I'm self-promoting myself for 1 second, in my book. So my account of the turning point and inevitably centered on the destroyer of painting, Caravaggio. But the effete, gentle Claude, born though he probably was in that same fateful year, 1600, does not appear to belong to that story at all. Claude seems, on the contrary, to incarnate a phase of retour à l'ordre on the Roman scene after the Caravaggesque upheaval. Turner, on the other hand, is still seen as one of the revolutionaries of art history, a painter whose treatment of color and composition both admired and loathed in his lifetime, anticipated the now celebrated groundbreaking art of Courbet and the Impressionists later in the century, and even in some cases announced the subsequent advent of outright abstract art. What did such an exciting artist find to admire and emulate in the work of a supposedly conventional, staid, and in the opinion of many, frankly boring painter such as Claude Lorrain? It seems that Turner saw in Claude something few people had detected in him previously. Indeed, something almost no one has seen in Claude even after Turner's sustained engagement with his predecessor's works. The port scenes, painted by both, I suggest, may be the key to this novel reading of Claude Lorrain as a much more interesting artist than what he had been hitherto considered to be. My lecture, then, is an attempt to save Claude by looking for that mysterious added value that Turner has uncovered, but as far as I know, never verbally formulated. Not yet, but there will be. And there will be, and from then on there will be pictures all the time, don't worry. I just didn't want to leave my book there for the whole time. But we can go directly to those, although they're not directly related to what I'm saying now. To be sure, every once in a while, the suspicion does arise in art history that there's more to Claude than had previously been assumed. The philosophical depth and sophistication uncovered in the works of his contemporaries, Nicolas Poussin and Philippe de Champaigne, by thinkers such as Louis Marin and T.J. Clarke, our contemporary interest in issues of nature and environment, the evident core of Claude's work, and perhaps even normal art historical ennui and the strive for originality might explain such periodical reversals of fortune. But critical attention to Claude remains all in all focused on the beauty, technical mastery, and socio-economic values of his deliciously escapist paintings. A recent attempt to save Claude from the predicament of over-aesthetization verging on anestheticization is presented in Frédéric Cousinier's masterly Esthétique de fluid aesthetics, sang, sperme, merde dans la peinture française du XVIIe siècle. In fact, our civilized painter prominently figures in the chapter dedicated to excrements, who would have thought, and the presence of some incongruous details, piles of detritus or a man defecating, is rightly taken to be a proof of Claude's dialectical qualities, resulting in a critical stance towards consecrated values such as the veneration for antiquity, the grandeur of Rome, or the ideal beauty of undisturbed nature. It is, says Cousinier, precisely the coexistence on a canvas of mighty achievements of culture, ancient or modern, with the mundane, the marginal, and even the outright disgusting that makes Claude's discreet undermining of social values potentially more powerful than some contemporaries' taste for pure scatological caricature. Cousinier's project captures something essential for the understanding of what one might call, for lack of better term, French Baroque art. It is, he claims, by way of representing bodily fluids, blood, sperm, and excrements are the examples treated most thoroughly, without excluding tears and maternal milk, that the Baroque counters the Renaissance obsession with geometry, contours, and measurability. And while this idea has obvious roots in the celebrated and controversial theories of Heinrich Wölfflin on the Baroque, it is here articulated in an original way through the flux of corporeal liquids. It is, however, possible to broaden the scope of Claude's dialectics much further, while remaining in the realm of liquidity. Indeed, Cousinier himself hints at such a program when he states that numerous Claude landscapes depict architectural elements shaped comme il faut by rigorous linear perspective that are framing phenomena of nature, water, clouds, air, vegetation, described as not géométrisable, not subject to geometry, and which thus resist the imperious domination of mathematics. Interested as he is in bodily fluids, Cousinier does not develop that promising insight, while he admits that the excremental hypothesis, intriguing though it is, remains, at least for quantitative reasons, exceptional in Claude's oeuvre and can hardly serve as a basis for generalization. Ultimately, Cousinier's hypothesis structures Claude's oeuvre around the dialectics of the high sublime, epitomized by the painter's blinding suns, and the low sublime of mundane terrestrial matter. This is seductive, but it seems difficult to organize broad portions of Le Lorrain's artistic corpus around this binary opposition, especially in the later period of the artist's career, from around 1640 onwards, when low-life genre scenes by and large disappear in favor of historical and mythological narratives, thus definitely tipping the scales towards the more conventional type of sublimeness. The duality of the geometrical and the formless, on the other hand, is extremely frequent in Le Lorrain's paintings and is hence of prodigious theoretical fecundity. It is thus a precious starting point for our quest for Claude's complexity and for that which in him fascinated Turner so much. One can reformulate the two extremities of the axis running from geometrical to formless according to numerous dialectical polarities: the finite and the infinite, nature and culture, geography and history, the spatial and the temporal, and even, as I did in a recent article, the Dionysian and the Apollonian. And of course, one can attribute to Claude a sustained interest in the constant oscillation between the solid and the liquid. While a dialectical tension thus broadly defined can be shown to be present in practically any painting by Claude, it is particularly prominent as a reading grid for one category of subject matter Lorrain, just like Turner, returned to again and again all through his long career, and in which it is solidity and liquidity that are directly juxtaposed. And this is obviously the theme of the Seaports. If we'd like to redeem Claude from the reactionary historical position often attributed to him, but without relying too much on the extremely rare appearances of indecorous materials, the eruption of what Matthew Hunter has called liquid intelligence in the midst of rock-solid framework, particularly present in depictions of seaports, might be our best bet. Claude being Claude, the destabilization enterprise is subtle and discreet. Indeed, pacey Claude's unintellectual reputation, it is truly dialectical, which does not prevent the cornerstones of the dialectical edifice from being as well defined as can be. Claude's solid are very solid, and the liquid elements, as we shall shortly see, the very quintessence of fluidity and refusal to be contained. It is perhaps ironic that I just used the seemingly banal and unremarkable metaphor of the cornerstones of the dialectical edifice. It is precisely such an idea of knowledge and discourse, an idea that is foundationalist and solid, that Claude's architectural pomposity express, and that its counterpart, the liquid element, bitterly mocks, undermines, and ultimately reveals to be untenable. That it does so on the same canvases where the mighty edifices of human hubris seem to be celebrated is precisely what makes Claude's dialectical statement so powerful. Before sailing on the tempestuous ocean of the philosophical Baroque as the context of Claude's original stance, let us cast an anchor for a little while in the more concrete, solid ground of some visual examples. So you'll get some visual examples now. Tracing the evolution of Claude's Seaports as a series, in the sense of George Kubler's The Shape of Time, that is a sequence of solution to a single artistic problem. Claude painted at least 20 port scenes. The exact number is debatable, as many coastal scenes contain boats and bays, but not the spectacularly built harbors that have become one of the artist's trademarks. If we accept port in the minimal sense only, they are particularly concentrated in the middle period of the painter's career, namely during the 1630s and especially the 1640s. We can also prolong the sequence, and we will do that, to some other port scenes, contemporaneous or slightly earlier, such as those by Paul Bril and by Claude's master, Agostino Tassi. The significance of the sequence depends on the postulation that port scenes are not just realistic depictions of places. Indeed, in Claude's case, almost none of his paintings represent an actual real harbor. We have to assume then that these scenes have a broader meaning. One important aspect of any port is its being a meeting point, an interface between the human and the natural, artifice and wilderness. As Susan Galassi defined them in the title of her catalog article on Turner's depictions of Dieppe and Cologne, ports are liminal spaces. It is the place where two different and incommensurable systems confront each other and interact. The sea is in the Western tradition. The French historian Alain Corbin has demonstrated that for the early modern period, the locus of the unknown, the savage, the untamed. A port is the outpost of civilization facing the sea, where the latter is partially disciplined, where the wild is as much as possible domesticated. The incommensurability of harbors, two components, becomes a problem when one is trying to represent a seaport in painting. The representational system that had been developed since the beginning of the Renaissance, with linear perspective as its star feature, excels in the depiction of finite, calculable portions of space. The sea, however, has no limits, no visual coordinates, no linear elements of any kind. This is the problem that artists were facing throughout our pictorial sequence, whose undeniable hero is Claude Lorrain. Just drink some water, because we're speaking about water. The sequence can be said to begin with Claude's Roman master, Agostino Tassi. As any starting point of a sequence, this one is somewhat arbitrary. Indeed, in the Northern European tradition, port scenes were common before the 17th century, and Claude was, of course, familiar with northern examples, being himself a foreigner in Rome, like many of his predecessors. But as a formal sequence, the concise trajectory from Tassi via Paul Bril to Claude's different career stages is highly interesting. It encompasses a period in which the infinite, as a concrete ontological possibility, emerged in Europe. This happened at the end of the 16th century in the writings of Giordano Bruno. A few decades later, as we can see and as we can and will see in Blaise Pascal's famous musings on man's lonely position in the midst of terrible, imponderable infinity, this idea was no longer a heretical folly. In the meantime, the sea had already forced painters to confront the existence of something that seemed to have no visible limits, even when infinity as a cosmological principle had not yet been fully admitted. Agostino Tassi, working in Rome in the 4 decades immediately following Bruno's execution there in 1600, chose to depict seaports and was thus directly confronted with the major pictorial problem of the representation of infinity. Worse still, the configuration of a port, as I mentioned before, required the co-presence of the maritime figure of the infinite with the strictly finite and well-defined contours of man-made architecture. Tassi's solution, perhaps typical to many second-order artists, was to bypass the problem. To be sure, Tassi's career was not monolithic and included more than one solution to our problem, but if we disregard nuances, Tassi's ports follow a single repeated pattern. His canvases are almost entirely filled with the imposing edifices of an imaginary port. The open sea is relegated to the side or framed by the harbor's architecture, paradoxically dwarfed by the latter's impressive dimensions. In other cases, the view towards the limitless sea is blocked by sizable vessels. Hence, Tassi leaves us very little to see of the sea and of the horizon, that limitless fictitious limit of maritime views. In Tassi's ports, there is no real dialectical relationship between the two mismatched components that make up a harbor. In a spirit that one could describe as humanist triumphalism, the human swallows the non-human, subjects it completely to its supposed supremacy. Tassi's solution to the problem of representing the interface of two incommensurable spaces was simply to not represent it. These are seaports without the sea, or in any case without the characteristics that make the sea such an ungraspable entity. Paul Bril, like Claude the Northerner in Rome and his predecessor as an illustrious landscape and seascape painter, has chosen the opposite evasion maneuver with a similar result. In Bril's composition, mostly from the second decade of the 17th century, we find seaports without a port, or more precisely, without the architectural, spectacularly artificial part of a harbor. To be sure, we do have some imposing boats with their system of rigging providing a grid of lines through which to look at the sea behind them, a motive that anticipates Claude's inventions. But the balance here seems to swing to the other extreme, and the human confrontation with the sea remains once again hardly represented. The infinity of the sea is visible and is partly domesticated when hidden from our view by the vessels, so that a step in the formal sequence has been made, but it is not yet Claude's fully fledged dialectics from the 1640s. Obviously, Claude Lorrain himself did not immediately achieve that masterful synthesis, the one that will signal a temporary ending to the sequence, being such a brilliant solution to the problem that launched the whole quest. A solution that will inspire artists from Claude Joseph Vernet in the 18th century to, of course, our beloved Turner. Claude went through several experimental solutions during his early period before the magic formula was found and the sequence entered its mature phase. So, an early example is the view of the port of Genoa, today at the Louvre in Paris, probably from the late 1620s. Here, the view is from the sea towards the city. Our visual space is clearly delimited, and the whole composition is based on a real existing port. The artistic problem is again avoided, or in other words, it is given a solution that fails to innovate. It is in the 1630s that Claude really embarked on his formal sequence of ports, the historical network of gradually altered repetitions of the same trait, as Kubler puts it, and where the pictorial problem of a seaport, the conjunction of two incompatible representational systems, is finally recognized and seriously explored. As I cannot here discuss all the numerous steps on that trajectory, let us look at some selected examples that will give us an idea of the general development of Claude's formal sequence of harbors. The fundamental artistic decision that veritably launched the series is the inversion of the painter's point of view. From now on, the port is seen from the land towards the sea. This is highly important, as in this case, one cannot avoid the direct confrontation with the sea's limitless nature. To be sure, Tassi and Brill, in earlier phases of the same sequence, phases that we can now call preparatory, have used a viewpoint from the land onwards. But they made concomitant choices that prevented the sequence from really taking off, after either closing the pictorial space, as we have seen in Tassi's case, or as did Brill, eliminating the architectural component of the port. Claude, from now on, is in the Louvre harbor scene with the Capitol Hill from 1636, combines all the ingredients that will result in his innovative formula. The sea open all the way to the horizon, imposing spectacular edifices denoting the classical, and in the foreground, a stripe of bare ground, locating the spectator's point of view in space and offering us a threshold to the painted world, while creating an in-between place that is neither wild and infinite as the sea, nor artificial and pompous as the edifices. As you can see, the synthesis at this stage is still imperfect. In fact, the infinity of the sea is only hinted at. It does not go much further than Tassi's claustrophobic compositions. Although the left-hand half of the picture is devoid of architecture and thus suggests a vertiginous opening, it is timorously separated from our view through the insertion of an elaborate, voluminous vessel. With the addition of two further boats and the lighthouse, the whole horizon can be seen only through a geometric grid of straight and diagonal lines. It is, as it were, tamed and made to incline in front of our superb epistemological tools. Only 1 year later, in 1637, Claude takes the formal sequence one step further. In these seaports with the Villa Medici, already mentioned as the model for Turner's regulars, now for a while here at the Frick, The opening of the composition is much more audacious. The general structure is quite similar to the former ones, palaces on the right, ships on the left, and the sea in the middle. But this middle section has now been completely transformed. A significant space has been left empty, as it were. Infinity, or at least its most perfect figure in our sublunar world, the sea, is now being exposed without further inhibitions. Indeed, the horizon is shown contiguously with another figure of the unknowable immensity of nature, the sun. The combined effect of the solar blinding and the sea's limitlessness disorients the viewer and contrasts dramatically with the pretentious, solid buildings flanking the shore. One would not be hard-pressed to find a historical or even an anthropological interpretation to this contrast. The technological pretentiousness of Europe is somewhat ridiculed by the confrontation with the mighty elements of the natural world. The Prado, the Madrid, then port of Ostia, with the embarkation of St. Paula from the late 1630s, presents an obvious change of format due to the nature of the Spanish Royal Commission, as well as other important, gradually altered repetitions of the same trait. The imposing edifices here line the port from both sides, symmetrically framing the opening to infinity. In the foreground is now a stone platform, emphasizing more than ever before the harsh conflict between the firm, clear-cut surfaces made by humans and the soft, hazy liquid expanse of the sea. The representation of architecture is following the strict rules of linear perspective, but its converging lines come together in the underdetermined area where the water and light irremediably blur our view. It is as if our eyes were gently led through curves and diagonals straight to their perdition in a place they cannot make sense of. Another important novelty of the Prado work is the inclusion, for the first time, of narrative content, whereas previous ports contained just genre scenes. This is not a formal element per se, but it did become a permanent feature of later harbor depictions, including the great 1640s compositions that are, in a way, the pinnacle of the whole series. And it did, of course, this idea of integrating narrative scenes, needless to say, inspired Turner in his own port scenes. So of the 5 or 6 seaports that Claude painted in the 1640s, a typical example is the London seaport with the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, the National Gallery in London. This famous 1648 painting is again in a horizontal format, but it presents a masterful reworking of the innovations we pointed out in the vertical Prado composition from a decade earlier. The intricate network of interpenetrating natural and artificial elements is here enhanced. One can finally talk about a real dialectical composition, where none of the two elements swallows the other, and in which the subtly rhythmical interaction and contrast is the very subject of the painting. The composition is clearly divided into a man-made realm in which linear perspective is an ultimate, rigid authority. This domain is situated on the right-hand half and on the left-hand quarter of the painting's width, and in the middle, the open expanse of the sea. There, it is not geometry that structures the image. It has no validity in the maritime domain, but the rising, hypnotizing sun. It has already been observed that Claude thus creates two competing centers in his compositions. But the two realms are far from being completely separated, and this is where one can speak of dialectics. The bridge, you see the bridge here. The bridge leading to the tower on the right is perhaps the focal point of this complexity, otherwise present elsewhere, everywhere on the canvas, and to which I will shortly return. The bridge is an agent of the solid sent to the heart of liquid matter. It is, just like the port itself, an example of human artifice and perspicacity in dealing with the elements that cannot be easily tamed. But obviously, the efficiency of such astuteness is limited. Nature flourishes unrestrained in the trees just above the bridge, and with irony usually unsuspected of Claude, reappears on the bridge itself, albeit in the domesticated, tidy form of potted plants. And the play goes on and on, with the geometrical but natural shells in the foreground, with the weeds invading the fissures in the architectural stone. We'll go back to all that a bit later. With the man in the foreground trying to look at and make sense of the sun, and so on. But before going back to this fascinating painting, let us follow the formal sequence of Claude's Seaports to its chronological term, just to take this off the table. So we arrive now at a much later example, this depiction of a harbor from 1674, nowadays at the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. It is barely a port, in fact, and thus only just qualifies for a sequence. But it does represent some boats, classical architecture flanking the sea, the two towers, and an opening. It is a much simplified version of earlier seaports. This minimalistic treatment can be interpreted as the final step of the sequence. Claude gave up narrative content and anecdotal detail to concentrate on what really interested him, on his quintessential artistic problem, the contiguous depiction of man-made geometrical objects and the open sea, here more boundless than ever before. The painter has finally arrived at a pure, concise solution to the pictorial problem that has accompanied him all along his creative life. Unfortunately, this promising theory suffers from a serious setback. The Munich painting is in fact an almost identical copy, made by Claude himself, of a much earlier work, today at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. The earlier work dates from 1634, the second one, the replica, from exactly 40 years later. The latter cannot, then, be simply described as the last accomplished step of the sequence. But neither can it be considered an early stage, immature and still searching, because 40 years later, Claude thought it appropriate to copy it without changing almost anything. Just like the paintings themselves, in which architecture from different periods coexists and confuses any attempt to achieve temporal clarity, the sequence of Claude's variations is thus much less linear and logical than we perhaps hoped it to be. This moment of confusion is a good opportunity to leave behind the historical description, revealed as ambiguous, and to go back to the high point of the series, the 1648 seaport with the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba. Our first impression here is that the sea, that menacing territoire du vide, territory of the empty, described by Alain Corbin in his eponymous book, is securely contained by the reassuring solidity of the stone surrounding it. It is contained in both senses of the English verb, literally held within, as the sea, in spite of its escape towards the inscrutable horizon, is mostly imprisoned inside the mighty stony mass, but also, and as a result, contained in the sense used by the United States when it hoped to achieve containment of the communist peril during the Cold War. The sea, source of early modern anxiety, according to Corbin, is controlled and restrained by the astute products of human ingenuity. Claude's painting, if we heed these first impressions, depicts the triumph of the human, of civilization, perhaps of the empire, against the malevolent forces of nature. But this, of course, would not be very dialectical. As we learn to suspect, there's more to Claude than this, and indeed, once we take a more attentive look, and we already started a bit to take this look, the fissures in the ground structure of civilization immediately appear, starting with some very literal ones. The ruin of what was once an impressive edifice, here on the left, is full of cracks, and the latter are invaded by small-scale representatives of uninvited nature, of the power of the wild. Where in better times polished stone proudly dominated the sea, little plants are now occupying every trace of the ravages of time. Whereas the situation on the right-hand side of the composition might seem less obviously fragile, signs of potential vulnerability and inevitable future decay actually abound. On top of the massive, modern, and impeccable palace dominating that area, statues solemnly stand. But here, as in most other seaport scenes, Claude seems to ironically emphasize not the ceremonial solemnity of these sculptures, but rather their impossibly unstable position, constantly on the verge of a fatal fall. Further towards the horizon, in the area we already briefly explored, the drama is enacted in botanical terms. Potted plants, we already mentioned those, decorously decorates the little bridge leading to the medieval-looking tower, nature once again emerging in the midst of a built environment, but here in the tamed, meticulously shaped, and almost parodically cute version, seemingly ridiculing nature's wild powers. The counter-reaction, however, is immediately visible in the form of the unrestrained, rebellious tree, ostentatiously higher than its palatial neighbor and arrogantly looming above its dwarfish, slavish relatives. The series of descriptive vignettes can go on and on. I haven't mentioned the foreground terrain vague, peacefully yielding to the advancing waves, nor the foam subtly dramatizing the frontal, more violent contact between the elements in their purest versions, nor even the wooden boats, processed natural materials sent as outposts of culture to the heart of nature. But before delving into the almost inevitable interpretation of this painting in terms of the dialectics of nature and culture, a problematically anachronistic distinction, let us follow some of these details as they gently drift us back to the more specific aspect of liquidity. The elements of the dialectic to and fro include one curious place in which Claude makes visible the intermingling of solid and liquid, or rather the presence of the confusingly fluid, even at the heart of the built, well-ordered realm. On the far side of the foreground, so here, where was I? Yeah. On the far side of the foreground, close to us, but perhaps as easy to miss as Poe's purloined letter, the sea itself surreptitiously penetrates the continental domain. The abnormally high density of onlookers almost hides the watery inlet, making the liquid invasion perhaps even more ominous. Right there and not clearly leading anywhere. Trivial and yet strangely unsettling, possibly just a tiny bay, but perhaps a never-ending fracture, hardly impressive, while sending the palace and the royal scene to a possibly inaccessible distance. At the core of a sober representation of a mineral world and hard contours, liquid is discreetly introduced, delimited and disciplined, and nonetheless potentially impertinent and destabilizing. The classic account of the fundamental importance of liquid imagery in Western, perhaps more generally in human societies, is Gaston Bachelard's L'eau et le rêve, Water and Dreams. For Bachelard, water, the quintessential liquid element, is the epitome of the transitory, the unstable, the vertiginously perilous. Water itself, a she in Bachelard's own French, is always flowing, always falling, always dying a horizontal death. La peine de l'eau est infinie, Bachelard dramatically concludes. And not only water itself is mortal, disappearing in deep, even infinite water is the archetypal human nightmare. More than a nightmare, it is human destiny. Even floating on water is a strongly disorienting experience. It is characterized by the innocuous word rêverie, but is above all, Bachelard quotes Michelet here, the loss of time and space, the blurring of any knowledge. It comes as no surprise then that at a time still struggling with the artistic heritage of Renaissance humanism, with the idea of art as the product of clear knowledge, of intellectual activity whose vectors are numerical and precise, at least as much as they are rhetorical and illusory, liquids at that time are a complication and a risk. Liquid subversion has a history before, an artistic history before Claude, of course. Titian and the Venetian school are the classic locus in which to start the narrative, and the role of the Serenissima in liquefying the art of painting was recounted time and again from the 16th century onwards. However, pictorial traditions and counter-traditions might not be enough to explain Claude's novel way of painting seaports. Following the habitual disclaimer to the effect that no direct theoretical activity or even interest is attested for Claude, and that no biographical facts link him to contemporary writers and thinkers, the stormy political climate of the 17th century, including the kind of thoughts that were suddenly conceivable, is important if we wish to substantiate Claude's original ideas, even if the latter were expressed by exclusively pictorial means. Among the figures of 17th century philosophy sometimes proposed as supplying potential intellectual patronage to Baroque art, one must mention Michel de Montaigne, and of course Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, as described by Gilles Deleuze, the emblematic thinker of the sinuous figure of the fold, impossible to rationalize and to contain, and hence the antithesis to Descartes' dominant philosophy, which is, for Deleuze, rigid and as it were obsessively straight. However, another thinker whose Baroque idiosyncratic credentials have always been undeniable can give us some further philosophical assistance in the contextualization of Claude's pictorial dialectics. It is the French polymath Blaise Pascal, and in particular his collection of pensées, thoughts or reflections. Louis Marin, that fabulous detector of structures, has described Pascal's work as a text whose fragmentary, structureless nature is not the random result of its process of composition, but part and parcel of its very essence. Pascal's work is Umberto Eco's opera aperta, open work, avant la lettre, and it is the philosopher's acute modern consciousness of the universe's infinity that brings home to him the absurd pretentiousness of striving to build knowledge in the image of a solid, architectural, measurable structure. Pascal mocks his contemporaries who, when philosophizing, use their geometrical spirit, believing that firm foundations, starting with definitions and then following on with principles, will make their construction valid, which is not the right way to act, Pascal wryly prescribes. For Marin, the author of the Pensées thus demonstrates a fin de siècle kind of thought, a strange delight at the unstableness of foundations, the jouissance of losing oneself in the infinite void or in immeasurable diversity. Pascal's epistemological pessimism and its corollary religious fervor are the direct result of the recognition that our place in the world is painfully insignificant. The idea that the universe is infinite, already defended by Bruno a few decades earlier, was becoming more acceptable. And the epistemological consequences of this metaphysical acknowledgement were now apparent. Significantly, that infinite universe can be understood as essentially liquid, as similar to the sea. One of the most famous brief pensées describes the background to our existence as not exactly liquid, but as one that resembles nothing less than Ptolemaic rigid spheres or Renaissance's rigorous linear perspective. And I quote, "The eternal silence of this infinite space horrifies me," says Pascal, who describes here the human predicament as being surrounded by silent, limitless space, lacking the sonic and the visual coordinates that solid elements would provide. The most immediate association here at the pre-space travel era must have been drowning and being swallowed up by water. Some of Pascal's metaphors, however, are more directly and evocatively liquid. In one version of the being lost in the middle of nowhere nightmare, man is described as being taken while asleep to a desert island. A real situation, Pascal suggests in another memorable image, is that we sail in a vast environment, uncertain and floating, pushed from one side to the other. Whenever we believe to find a firm place to attach ourselves to, it is revealed as unstable, it escapes us, and we follow it, it slips and flights us forever. Nothing ever stops for us. What is this evasive, slippery environment, this incessant to and fro of floating and oscillating, if not a liquid milieu, the eternal enemy of reason and stability, the very thing ports are meant to discipline? As befits a fragmentary, chaotic writer, Pascal's thoughts are often ambiguous, even contradictory. He famously declared that all human misfortunes are the result of our incapability to stay at rest within a room. Seafaring, directly confronting the liquidity around us, the infinite abyss filled with water, is then, of course, the most dangerous vice. But one might suspect Pascal here of irony, or else claim that the very inevitability of floating in the infinite fluid is what makes the thinker's ethical prescription so poignant and desperate. Pascal accuses painting of vanity, as it makes us admire the image of things that we do not admire in themselves. Perspective, he says, might work in assigning us a place from which to look at a painting, but is hardly helpful in the search for truth and morality. Art is not, for Pascal, a reliable interlocutor in his existential quest, and yet Claude's Seaports can be thought of as very close in spirit to the very doubts and caution that Pascal expresses at exactly the same period. A port is in itself, for the author of De Pensée, an epistemological metaphor, an ambiguous one once again. Those who are dans le règlement, out of order or not within the rules, tell those who are dans l'ordre, in order, that it is they who are far from nature and believe that they themselves follow nature. Just like those, and this is the image, who in a boat believe that those on the land are moving, free, or in flight. One needs a fixed point to judge. The port judges those who are on a boat, but where can we find a port in moral matters? This is Pascal. Ostensibly, the port represents here an ideal of fixity and reliability, unfortunately impossible to attain in moral questions. Surreptitiously, however, the port's absolute solidity is jeopardized by its textual contiguity with those dangerously naive people on a boat who are wrongly convinced that they occupy the stable point of reference to anything else. Is the port really a safe haven, or is it the worst illusion of them all? Pascal, not unlike Claude, insinuates a venomous doubt that goes against his seemingly simple message. The pious gambler consoles himself with the illusion that the destabilizing fluidity can perhaps be avoided in God's domain. The rivers of Babylon flow and fall and carry along. O Saint Zion, he exclaimed with some dose of wishful thinking. O holy Zion, where all is stable and nothing falls. Claude, concerning ports, suggests the doubt without even bothering to counter it with blessed divine fixity. As we've seen, Claude sets side by side the sumptuous, seemingly stable man-made architecture on the one hand and the untamed sea on the other. He thus represents the dialectics accompanying millennia of human civilization, of striving to control the uncontrollable, to measure the immeasurable, and ultimately to represent the irrepresentable. An effort that in the 17th century goes on, accelerates, and consequently, perhaps paradoxically, runs into its limits and with unprecedented force. Claude's ports are thus a comment on the ongoing enterprise of containing the liquid element, the flexible, the ungraspable, an effort irrevocably doomed, but nonetheless necessary and constitutive of what it is to be human. It is not simply the theme of seaports, what one might even call Claude's obsession with them, that announces all these complex anthropological statements. While, as we've seen, ports has been represented before Claude, it is Lorrain's subtle structural innovations and invention that undermine the normative depiction of harbors as unambiguous safe havens, monuments to the triumph of human enterprise and spirit in the face of the unruly alterity of liquid nature. I already described the ongoing play of form and formless, of history and botany, of construction and fishing, the never-to-be-resolved dialectics that only a detailed analysis of Claude's compositions bring into light. But other elements join the nuanced treatment that takes the panegyric to rocky resistance and turns it into a hymn to fragility and to liquid intelligence. The daring turning around of the composition so that we face the endless open sea and the blinding sun is one of the transformations Claude applied in his mature years. Another is the inclusion of boats whose complex system of masts and rigging provides a grid of lines through which to look at the sea and the sky behind them, reminiscence of Alberti's veil or Dürer's perspectival devices. It is precisely the futility of the implied endeavor of mapping the ungraspable and geometrizing liquidity that exudes subtle irony lost on the traditional reception of Claude as the elegiac poet of glory and nostalgia. I have a few more minutes. Bear with me, please. If Claude's seaports are to be considered as pictorially raising historiographic issues, it shouldn't be forgotten that from the 1640s onwards, the artist included in them proper historical themes, albeit always at the margins of the composition and on a small scale. Turner, for one, took his cue for his own representations of seaports from these narrative vignettes. Some of these in Claude are clearly marked by the vagaries of history and by the fragility of human existence. Ursula's looming martyr in London and the much later Dido episode in Hamburg are typical examples of that category, where the vanity of spectacular harbors is echoing the merciless fate striking specific human beings. The seaport with the embarkation of the Queen of Sheba, however, depicts a rather optimistic story. The queen, with her royal retinue, is ready to leave for the journey that will bring her to Jerusalem, where King Solomon, the builder of the temple, will receive her. The sea here, far from being the dangerous no man's land it usually connotes, is an intercultural trajectory leading to exchange and enrichment. Claude's dialectics is capable of accommodating this too. By definition, it is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It is a prudent warning against hubris, but also an acknowledgement of the necessity of ports. It is all the more poignant that the Queen of Sheba embarks on her ambitious expedition from a harbor already showing signs of decay and irrevocable fragility, and that her quest for knowledge and discovery is nonetheless launched. When Claude thus forces the hard-edged products of human ingenuity to confront their suppression and eventual dissolution in the eternal flux of the universe, when he recognizes the necessity of both a solid and a liquid approach to the world, he ends up commenting on the status of knowledge itself and its representations, be they verbal or pictorial. And through his visual version of dialectics that never culminates in Hegelian synthesis, Claude sketches a novel epistemology, specifically painterly, and at the same time akin perhaps to some late 20th century theories representing humanistic knowledge as the product of social negotiation rather than the result of calculations and proof. In all these cases, hard, solid knowledge is constantly critiqued by a more malleable, soft kind of intelligence, for which liquid is surely an adequate term. Needless to say, Claude has never thought in these terms, nor was he even involved in the active scene of skepticism and liquid thinking that anticipated by 3 centuries its 20th century reincarnation. but in his discreet way, questioning the prerogatives of solid architecture, of all-encompassing linear perspective, and of firm, totalizing principles, Claude Lorrain used the visual medium of painting to liquefy a by then petrified worldview. I contend that he thus deserves, against all odds, a place in the Hall of Fame of fluid practitioners, of the explorers of flux, and of the pioneers of just the kind of painting that modernism brought to us in much more forthright versions. So now the coda. If interpreting thus Claude as a pictorial theoretician of European and Mediterranean culture and its inherent dualities, as a discrete forefather of sophisticated thinking on visual knowledge emerging in the 19th and 20th century still seems far-fetched, I wish in conclusion to go back to the person who initially brought us all here and whom I chose to recruit as a precious ally. Turner, I contend, is not only Claude's greatest admirer in the history of art, but also perhaps the French painter's most perceptive interpreter. And he indeed saw in Claude something only rarely observed. To go back to our starting point, it is important to remember the titles Turner gave two of the most important pictures he painted after Claude, one of which is forever exhibited at the National Gallery in London in front of its Claudian source of inspiration at Turner's explicit request. These two paintings, then, are titled respectively Dido Building Carthage, or The Rise of the Carthaginian Empire from 1815, and from 2 years later, the Tate lengthily titled, really lengthily, The Decline of the Carthaginian Empire, Rome being determined on the overthrow of her hated rival, demanded from her such terms as might either force her into war or ruin her by compliance, and it's not over yet. The enervated Carthaginians, in their anxiety for peace, consented to give up even their arms and their children. This painting was also intended to hang alongside Claude's, but was replaced by another in circumstances that are discussed in Gillian Forrester's contribution to the Frick Catalogue. So the short titles are The Rise of the Carthaginian Empire and The Decline of the Carthaginian Empire. That's the only thing you should remember. Turner, then, already considered Claude's Seaports as visual essays on the vicissitudes of history, on the rise and decline of whole Mediterranean civilizations, and more generally on the ephemerality of civilization, a leitmotif in Turner's own depictions of ports, according to Joanna Seidenstein. Turner's later Regulus takes to an extreme Claude's pattern of, these were the two others, the rise and the decline. No, and this is Regulus. So, takes to an extreme Claude's pattern of solid, concrete, ambitious architecture, made somewhat pathetic when its rigid perspective leads the eye to a blinding, glaring vapor impossible to make sense of. As opposed to his critical champion, John Ruskin, who scorned both Claude Lorrain and Turner's reworking of him in the Carthage paintings, Turner has understood that for Claude, in spite of his reputation as creator of nothing more than serene, old-fashioned beauty, seaports were not only decorative places, the playfield of light and color. Ports are the fulcrum of history, the place where different antagonistic forces compete and fight for the soul of human culture, where Apollo and Dionysus, the orderly and the chaotic, the civilized and the wild, the measurable and the internally elusive, all interact, collide, and sometimes intermingle to create the fragile, plural, ambiguous entity that is sometimes called civilization. Thank you very much. And I think we can all go and see the paintings.